40 years of legal precedent. The decisions were in two separate cases brought by the group Students for Fair Admissions against Harvard and the University of North Carolina.
Ahead, Harvard law professor Ron Sullivan will join us to walk through the implications of the decision and where it falls in the history of race and law in America. We'll talk to journalists from our GBH News education desk. Then we'll hear about the driving forces behind the Supreme Court cases at the heart of it all, and students from the Coalition for a Diverse Harvard that campaigned against the lawsuits. And most importantly, we want to hear from you, all of you. Give us a call or send us a text at 877-301-8970, or comment right on our live stream on our GBH News YouTube page, and we'll respond later in the show.
But first, GBH News headed to Harvard Square after the ruling came down.
People from, 1950s and 60s, they fought for those actions to give, African Americans, Hispanics, Latinos different opportunities and better opportunities, and then just to see that gutted is somewhat frustrating.
A large, very vocal majority here on campus was very supportive of affirmative action. We realize the role that it plays in admissions equity and in creating a more diverse Harvard.
I see both the negatives and the positive sides to it. So not having affirmative action kind of gives all students a fair chance, but at the same time it also may take away the diversity of a college campus. So I think it'll definitely change the kind of community that I'm in, but I don't think it should have too much of a big change.
The reason we need affirmative action is that we still have systemic racism and oppression at all levels before people come to college.
Racial diversity, I think it's so important. We really can't have a well-rounded education without taking into consideration all perspectives. Affirmative action, in my experience, is a way for us Asian Americans, all API communities, to be able to express where we're coming from and express our identities.
I think that having different races within a school community kind of brings different perspectives and just brings us together as a community.
I really hope that we can actually find some mechanism to replace it that, will be able to be upheld in the Supreme Court.
I think it's important to realize that even though the court did not rule in favor of upholding affirmative action, that this does not represent the fight for equity in college admissions, the fight for equity in higher education. And I think that's really what's important, that people keep fighting for equity in admissions.
We've heard a lot of commentary and criticism the past 24 hours or so, but what exactly does this ruling mean for college admissions and diversity on campus?
To help us answer those questions, we're joined now by Ronald Sullivan, Jr., a professor of law and the director of the Criminal Justice Institute at Harvard Law School. Thank you so much for joining us, Ron Sullivan.
Thank you so much for having me.
So let's ask the obvious question. How can you seat this, or how do you seat this decision in the context of race and law in this country?
Well, it's in the pantheon of the lowest decisions that we've seen in the Supreme Court. I think it was a sad day when the court came down with this ruling, upending 40 some odd years of strong precedent and really ignoring the reality of race in America. History will not treat this decision well.
Do you have a sense of how soon we'll see actual impact of this? How is it going to change people who are applying for college right now? And are we going to start to see lawsuits from people who say they've been discriminated against?
Well, on the first part of your question, we've got data that show that at the state level, that when these anti-affirmative action bills come down, that the numbers of African-American and Latina students drop precipitously, sometimes up to 50%. I suspect that we will see that at many state schools and schools that aren't as highly resourced as schools like Harvard, Yale, Princeton, the Ivy Leagues. I think they will figure out a way and have the resources to figure out a way to maintain a diverse student body, which leads to your second question. There are going to be a ton of follow-up lawsuits with people claiming that the school is not following this new decision and sort of trying to figure out what the nuances of the decision means. So the bottom line is it's going to hurt a generation of Black and brown people considerably because they will not have the opportunity to get a college degree. That's bad for them, and that's bad for the country.
Now, two words that are two expressions we heard a lot of in this decision: colorblind. That's Justice Clarence Thomas, who wrote the opinion that, well, Roberts wrote the opinion, but he definitely supported it, that, you know, it's time. It's a colorblind society. We can work with that. But as we heard from Sotomayor and also Ketanji Brown Jackson, this is, they say, not the reality. We're living in a society that does not see colorblind. And also, the law at which this case was based on was itself race conscious in making the decision. Can you speak to that?
Well, that is absolutely right. You can come teach my class. That's absolutely 100% right. And that's the irony here, because the conservative bloc of the court, they project themselves as historicists, as original and following original intent. Both of the amendments that they rely on, well, the Equal Protection Clause 1 and then the 14th Amendment, were race conscious. They considered race. They were written for freed slaves. So to now say that these race conscious portions of the Constitution compel a colorblind analysis is ahistorical and acontextual, and quite frankly, doesn't make a lot of sense. This notion, Justice Roberts likes to say, Chief Justice Roberts, likes to say that you can't cure racial discrimination by additional racial discrimination. I mean, that is so glib and so arid in its formalism that it is absolutely infuriating. Of course, you have to use race in order to repair the damage that was done over centuries. Reparatory justice, we do it all the time for all sorts of groups in the United States. And for the Supreme Court to come out this way, I think Justice Sotomayor is correct, and Justice Jackson is correct that it ignores the reality of race in the country.
Professor, I wanted to ask you about one thing that really struck me in the decision that I've not heard talked about as much as some of the other aspects, and that is there is an exception for certain schools in this decision, those schools being military academies. That military academies apparently still can use race as a consideration in this way. And Justice Jackson referred to this in a very scathing way in her rebuttal. But could you explain to us that exception and the reasoning behind it?
Reasoning might be a strong word. So yes, that is an exception. It's hard to harmonize that exception with the rest of the opinion, right? If the foundation of the opinion is that the Constitution is colorblind, then the Constitution is colorblind, and you can't have this exception. But what Justice Roberts does is he does two things. He says, well, there may be different interests in military academies. That's one. And two, that case is not before me. So we'll look at that later. So he gave himself a little bit of an escape route, but theoretically and conceptually, it really doesn't follow his opinion. Now, Justice Thomas, love him or hate him, he's consistent, right? He says no race in anything, period. Schools, public contracting, anything. So he goes all the way down and goes all in on this notion of colorblind constitutionalism. Now, there have been some scholars who come out and said that, well, you know what? The military draws so much from minority communities and poor communities that we need minorities in the military. And because of that, they're going to still allow a race-conscious admission policy into these schools in order to funnel more people of color into the military. So that's a rather cynical view here, but it's an explanatory framework as good as any other.
So let me go to the one piece of the decision that's a little confusing for some of us. So you may not directly consider race, as the decision makes clear, but then Roberts add, but if you write about it in your personal essay, well, that's okay. Now that, to me, I don't know how that works. That seems to me that we're going to end up in court again, because that's part of who people are from these marginalized communities, but that is, of course, taking into their race. So please explain how that works.
So you are right. That's going to be the subject of endless litigation, that sentence or two in there. What I take Chief Justice Roberts to be saying is that race can be used in an individual capacity as a proxy for some other value, like character, courage, ability to overcome, but not in a systematic way. So what he would probably say is that at Harvard and UNC, they gave people a boost, put the thumb on the scale, gave them an extra 1/10 of a point for this racial characteristic, notwithstanding anything individual about them, just a whole class. So what he seems to be saying is that if you write, listen, I was poor, Black, discriminated against, teachers didn't give me a chance, they put me in the slow classes, but I worked so hard, and my mom pushed and I persevered, and I applied here, I've got good scores and good grades. That can be used as a criterion for admission. So it's not race directly, though race is part of that story. Now, you're probably thinking, how do you disaggregate the two? How do you decouple the two? I don't know. So some people are going to come back and argue that, yes, they're still using race. Anything with race in it is prohibited by the Constitution, and it's going to work its way back up to the Supreme Court, and we'll have to see what the Supreme Court says about that. If I can just say one more thing. So it is ambiguous, and I don't think that's a bad thing, right? Usually the Supreme Court embraces a value that we call prudentialism. What that means is that the court rules very narrowly on issues, very narrowly, allows things to work its way up over years and years in the lower courts, and only does what it has to. So that way it doesn't make mistakes, right? Now, this court has by and large ignored this value of prudentialism, but here it's not a bad thing. It's ambiguous, and I think it's going to give the schools some room to still get a diverse population of people.
Just curious in terms of like the actual application process. Does this mean that there's no longer a box you tick on the application indicating your race? The only place to talk about that is your essay?
I would imagine they'll get rid of the boxes at this point. What they can't get rid of, though, is the lived experiences of students, because the resume might have, the Black Students Association on there, or, a member of Jack and Jill, of African American Social Organization. So it's going to be difficult to completely remove any reference of race there. So the committees will know. And the question is, how will they deal with that information?
It seems like there's going to be a whole new level of maybe college counseling now for kids to figure out the right ways to signal their race in a way that's acceptable in their application.
Yeah, I think that's right. And to talk about the ways in which they have overcome certain barriers or hurdles that were placed there because of race. Now, but in many ways, that's not even the real issue there. If folks were worried about qualifications of folks getting into school, then they should look at legacy admissions, right? I mean, and the special deans lists where the children of big donors fall. So the numbers, the difference between blacks and whites and Asians, those numbers. I mean, there's small differences on the bell curve, but you look at the legacies and sports and so forth, huge differences. So if you're really worried about a meritocratic system, then let's look at those issues. But I don't think that's really the issue there.
We don't have much time, but Ron Sullivan, is it true, in fact, that Asian American students now will be harmed by this? The assumption is because they were put forward that they would do better by this decision, but that the other evidence suggests not.
It's hard to say, and I think we'll just have to wait and see what happens. I've read the same reports that you have that says this opinion will inject far more subjectivity into the process than before, and that that population may be injured. So we will have to wait and see. The curious thing or interesting thing, I know we have to go, about Harvard is that last year the Asian population was up a little bit under this now unconstitutional schema. So we will just have to wait and see what happens. It's hard to predict.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Pleasure.
The legal effort to ban the consideration of race in college admissions has been going on for nearly a decade, since GBH News first launched our education desk.
Reporter Kirk Carapeza has been covering it ever since. He joins me now, as does education editor Meg Woolhouse. So, how does this decision impact the diversity on campus?
Well, as the professor said, it's hard to say, but experts are predicting that the bottom line is we'll see less racial diversity on campus, right? If colleges can't consider a student or an applicant's race, they'll have to use these race-neutral or race-blind policies. And I think the leaders we've been talking to are still processing the decision, exactly what it says. But they say if admissions officials can't consider that race, it's going to hurt everyone on campus, right? I mean, the argument they made in court and outside of court was that racial diversity on campus is good for everyone, right? It's good for education, it's good for research, it's good for democracy. And this case was really about selective schools. We should be clear about that, right? These were the only 200 really selective schools are using this kind of holistic approach where they consider race as one factor among others. But the ruling could send the wrong message to students of color too, right? Who are thinking about applying to these schools. And they already really don't see themselves on campus. And if the racial diversity goes down and they don't see themselves even more, then they're going to be less likely to apply to school. But I think everyone is telling me that this is a big step backwards, but they're not stopping. They're committed to their mission and these new diversity, equity, inclusion goals that they've set for themselves. So I think it's going to be really interesting to see where they go next.
How do we know, and do we know, that this will lead to absolutely less diversity in schools?
Well, 9 states have already banned the practice of using race in admissions, and in many of those states, we've seen declines in the Black and Latino population. So there's evidence that's pretty damning, if you will, about right. What is going to happen.
After the trial in Boston, we went out to California to look at what happened there and the initiatives they were putting in place. And if you look at the study there, the voters outlawed affirmative action at public schools in 1996. So we have more than 20 years of research on this to see what actually happened, right? And immediately the percentage of Black students, Black, Hispanic, and Native American students dropped precipitously at the most selective public schools. So think, UCLA, Berkeley. At UCLA, the percentage of Black students fell by more than half in 2 years. In 1996, it was 7%, and by 1998, it dropped to about 4%. And in 10 years later, in 2006, they only had 96 incoming Black students at UCLA.
So that, you said earlier that the schools have come out and said they're committed to try to keep, their standards around diversity up. But you've just cited statistics
right.
at places where those schools too said we're going to get rid of quote unquote affirmative action, but we're going to still
right.
maintain it. It didn't work.
Right. It takes a lot of work. It takes a lot of resources. As the professor said, schools like Harvard, Yale, Princeton, these schools have resources to pull this off, right? To really, embed their admissions counselors in these marginalized communities and find those talented students. But if you're a tier below that or 2 tiers below that, these schools, the secret about higher ed is, my beat ricochets between the Moakley Courthouse, where you have higher ed on trial for 2 separate cases, Varsity Blues and this case, right? And then the rest of the state, you go out west, a lot of schools are struggling to fill their seats. They just need full-pay students. Right? They don't have the resources to go and find these students. Meg and I worked on a story recently looking at Merit Aid. These schools are giving billions of dollars to families that don't necessarily need the money, right? Because they need students. And to get them in, they give them quote unquote meritor scholarships, right? So if you have $20,000, why would you give it to one low-income student of color when you can give it to 4 or 5 students, middle or higher income students who can afford to pay the rest? These schools, the average tuition discount now at 4-year private colleges in New England for first-year students is north of 60%. They're desperate for students.
Can I add on to that
please.
too? Because I want to get back to Professor Sullivan's point about legacy admissions. When you think about this ruling in the context that Harvard admits more than 40% of its freshman class through legacy admissions, as well as athletic admissions and the families of donors, that's a really staggering number. And Harvard has had quite some time to just have a little bit more accountability here for them. They've had decades where these rulings have come down and haven't taken steps to address this, maybe through some of the preferences given to legacy students. And so what we have now is a situation where we see Asian students and African American students being somewhat pitted against each other in this scenario. And I think that we have to keep an eye on that. We have to remind ourselves what this is about. It's about white privilege.
Yeah.
Professor Sullivan was talking about some of the workarounds, like that Judge Roberts talked about, of ways to consider race without considering race in the wrong way. And you talked about the way that some schools are talking about maybe approaching that. Are there examples from these places that have gone through this where they have been able to make those workarounds successfully?
If you look at, we looked at Georgetown, they got a big splash, a lot of press and positive coverage when they identified some of the descendants of slaves who were sold by the Jesuits back in the 1800s. And they went down, college administrators went down to Louisiana, met with them. They pledged to treat these descendants of slaves the same way that they treat the sons and daughters of alumni. We went back years after they made that pledge and found that they'd only admitted about 20 in 6 years. And there's a researcher here in Cambridge who estimates there are 10,000 descendants of those 270 slaves who were sold. So that's one idea that was being proposed. Whether it works or not, and how our friend Henry Louis Gates could help us have people trace their ancestry and find out who's a descendant or not. It gets into all kind of legal issues, and like the professor was saying, if you're using slave descent status as a proxy for race, it might just lead to another lawsuit. Right, but other ideas are, they could admit more community college students, right? We worked on a story recently about transfer credits, where only 40% of credits transfer from institution to institution. If they just made it easier for some students at community colleges to transfer into these more highly selective schools, that would increase their diversity numbers, because those schools are serving mostly low-income students of color.
Well, what you've just described is really about a question of will. So
right.
you can state what you want to do and if you want to do it. But let's talk about income. Using income, because people say that's what we can do. That's a race neutral. That's what the justices put forward.
Sure.
How does that work or not work?
Well, I don't think that we've tested that out yet. I think that that's a path that we could go down. Colleges have said that they're going to recruit more in marginalized communities. This is another, test of will. But that turns out to be quite expensive, and they haven't done it. So I think that it's a big question mark, really, what you're asking. We don't know.
But there is pressure on these schools to admit more low-income students. I mean, some student advocates think that these schools like Harvard, Yale, Princeton should admit at least 20, maybe 30, maybe 40% low-income students to reflect the population, right? If you really wanted to reflect the population of the U.S., 40% of your students would be low-income, right? At these schools, it's about, 15, 16, 17%? But if, in the trial, one of the witnesses suggested this, saying they should just focus on socioeconomics. But if you did that, the majority of poor people in this country are white, right? So that wouldn't diversify the class.
Yeah, that was going to be my next thing, is that the majority of those folks are, so you're really in a that's not going to work. And people keep putting it forth, and the justices, particularly Clarence Thomas, is
right.
Really
and I think Chief Justice Roberts suggested this as one way that this is something they could do.
And then we also don't know what lawyers might consider, or Bloom's movement might consider as a proxy for race, and continue this barrage of lawsuits against colleges and universities to keep any consideration, any race consciousness out of colleges.
I think I want to have you all explain, because people are saying, what's the big deal? It's all elite colleges. Why do we have to worry about that?
Right.
But just to make it clear that these are where most of our leaders come from.
Right.
And so if that's happening, then it becomes very important to figure out what's happening in these admission policies.
Right. Most, if not all, of the justices on the court went to one of these schools. Right. Our CEOs come from these schools. But it really is interesting. I mean, there's a level of obsession with college admissions mania around these schools, but it does feed into the pipeline of our workforce and of people who work in the media. But it's really fascinating to think, when I think about this case 10 years later now, and kind of the things that stick out for me in some of the moments. I mean, obviously the lawsuit was filed here in federal court in Boston. It went to trial in 2018, but the decision in 2019 that kind of upheld Harvard's case was the federal judge quoted Toni Morrison, I remember, and she said, race is the least reliable information that you can have about somebody. But until those words are understood and accepted, we can't close the door on race-conscious admissions. And that kind of, I think, captured the Harvard side. The plaintiffs obviously disagreed with that. And it was amazing to see this case. They kept pushing this. The appeals court sided with Harvard. They appealed that, and it ended up before the Supreme Court.
And the lower courts did not agree, by the way.
No, they did not.
They did not.
The judge here, and even the three-judge panel, which was appointed by, I think George Bush Sr. had a judge who was appointed. It wasn't all, Clinton and Obama appointees on that judge. Even there, we sat through the trial. Esteban Bustillos and I, one of the other reporters here, were in the courtroom every single day of the trial, waiting to hear an Asian American take the stand and make the case. And the plaintiffs remained anonymous. We saw some applications with notes scribbled in the margins that may or may not have showed implicit bias, but we never heard from an Asian American who said, I was discriminated against based on my race and kept out of Harvard. It wasn't until this case went to the Supreme Court that then the plaintiffs introduced me to students who made that claim, although they didn't have concrete evidence.
We're talking to a lot of people in academia, obviously, who are aghast at this decision, and a lot of thinkers who are talking about the ways in which it can have a really negative effect. But in terms of how typical people feel about this decision, where does the state stand on this?
Yeah, we polled on this. We had GBH spent some money on a poll in 2018, right before the trial. We wanted to know where Americans stood on this, and so we surveyed 1,000 Americans. And on this issue, it gets messy because it's all about how you frame the question, right? So I think we said, do you support the consideration of race in admissions? And 72% of Americans said no. But then we followed up and said, do you value racial diversity on campus? 90% said yes. And then so we started following up, well, how do you expect schools to achieve racial diversity without considering race? And we got some interesting answers. But I saw PBS and NPR just did a poll, and they asked the question a different way. They said, do you support race-conscious programs? And 60% of Americans said yes. But we're totally divided on this. Men are less likely to support these programs, and Republicans and Trump supporters, I think it was 2/3 of Trump supporters said, no way, these programs should be completely abolished. So like many issues right now, our country's completely divided.
And I'll add to that too, that teachers, on the ground are condemning this, whether in unions or speaking out against it, because I think that they see the reality that we are far from a discrimination-free society. And so moving forward, I think we can only expect to see more lawsuits. I hate to say it, but more.
It was interesting hearing you say how it depends on how the question is phrased. It reminds me a bit about the warring opinions in this case, where people are using terms like colorblind society,
and both sides are claiming to be civil rights activists, right? You look at how Bloom responded to his win. He's claiming that this is, a multi-ethnic. This is going to lead to some kind of multi-ethnic, multiracial society. It's really interesting how they're kind of each co-opting each other's language.
Well, Jesus. Well, Kirk Carapez and Meg Wildhaus, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Don't forget to give us a call, send us a text, 877-301-8970, or leave a comment on our live stream on our GBH News YouTube page. We'll respond later in the show.
Next up, we'll hear from one of the members of the Students for Fair Admissions and other advocates who are celebrating the Supreme Court's decision.
Finally, we see, yes, we can be equally protected by the Constitution, regardless of our background, our race, or our national origin.
I'm ecstatic about this decision. It means that Asian Americans can finally get treated on their merits.
For so long, Asian Americans have strived for acceptance and recognition. Affirmative action is a well-intentioned idea that is poorly executed in reality.
If race affects a person's personal experiences as an individual, of course that could be considered. What we oppose is dividing people into a few racial groups and give one specific group some kind of group favorable treatment. Then that is racial group privilege.
It is my hope to see a renewed college admission system that recognizes and rewards the multifaceted talents and diverse perspective that each individual can bring to the table.
The cases against Harvard and UNC hinged on accusations of discrimination against Asian American applicants. But the Asian American perspectives on affirmative action are as diverse as the community itself.
We're joined now by Shruti Kumar, co-founder of the Harvard Affirmative Action Coalition, and Kausar Yazin, a member of the Coalition for a Diverse Harvard. Shruti, Kausar, thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much for having us.
So, Shruti, I'll start with you. Can I get your reaction to this decision, how you and your friends are feeling about this?
Yeah, I think given the composition of the Supreme Court, the decision itself, I don't think was surprising. But nonetheless, I think the consequences of the case has left, the diverse student body at Harvard incredibly shocked, as well as students across the campuses. I think what disappoints me most is the definition of democracy that the Supreme Court has put forward with this case. The lack of recognition that we live in a multiracial democracy. Our society, is incredibly colorful. And our Constitution should reflect that and take that into account. And so, I think, we're scared to see that, maybe the hallways that we walk, the classrooms we sit in, the dining halls we eat in may not be as diverse as they are now. And that's, I think, what scares me most.
Kausar, your reaction?
Yeah, initially, it was very gut-wrenching, I think, because although we all kind of expected this kind of an outcome, I personally didn't expect something to go as far as Harvard and UNC's admissions policies to violate the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. I was just completely appalled that that was the decision it came to. I had assumed that it was probably going to be something lighter. But yeah, as someone that's benefited greatly from diverse environments, just from my first year at Harvard alone this past year, I am terrified for the future years and what my next 3 years brings, especially as this new college admission cycle looms over our heads and what that looks like.
And both of you, I'm sure, know that how Asians were brought up in this case initially as they were being a group that was being disadvantaged in the applications process. Do you feel like that is or was true, and how do you feel about this decision in the context of that?
Yeah, I think, you can go ahead.
Oh, okay. I feel like that I benefited greatly from discussing my racial identity. I identify as Uyghur American, and so I am of course, Asian American, but also an underrepresented minority within Asia. And I think that that's dictated a lot of my experiences growing up in my suburban East Texas town, just because I could count on one hand how many Asian American classmates I had graduating with me. And so that definitely delegated and decided how my high school experience was especially with how people pronounced my name or assumptions people would make. And so just being put in a diverse space alongside other also underrepresented groups, whether that be underrepresented Asian minorities and also just across the board, Black students and Hispanic students, I felt my differences finally be embraced. And truly that's also dictated a lot of my advocacy work in high school as well, as I fought for racial equality. And these were just core parts of my application. And I don't see myself probably getting into Harvard without these things.
Oh. And Shruti?
Yeah, I think my understanding from the opponent's side in terms of how race factors into these admissions processes is that race alone doesn't reject you or get you into any of these spaces, right? And I think one of the emphases that they made in the court's opinion was that it's a holistic admissions process. Race influences just as much your ACT score, your extracurriculars, your worldview, as all of those things affect your opportunities, right, to get to these places. And so I think there's an underlying question of educational inequality in the U.S. that we're not talking about, and that this case has brought up. I think the opponents also, did something smart in the sense that they were used tactics and manipulation to really twist the picture of what the admissions process is. And what I mean by that—
So talk about that.
Yeah, and so the admissions process itself is an emotionally charged process, right? Students are putting themselves out there, digging deep to understand who they are, what they care about, and trying to convince a committee of, people that they're worth it, right? And so that can be scary. Everyone has experienced this, from submitting a job application to, writing up your resume. Are you enough, right? And that's the question that a lot of students have going into this process. It's incredibly emotionally charged. And so, when students receive rejections, I think it can be easy to point to something like a checkbox to say, oh, that's why you didn't get in, right? And I think statements like that, can offer a sort of comfort to students that feel like they've done everything possible to do, what they can to get in, but then to have something to blame, which is a checkbox on an application, is something that I think SFFA and the opponents saw and, used as a tactic to advance this case forward. And I think, the application process is hard. It's hard for everyone. I don't think any of the students that get into any competitive schools really thought they would get in for sure. I think we all try our best and, see how it goes from there. But I think, the admissions process itself is holistic. And I think that's largely what was forgotten in this case.
You're making me think how, being Asian American and having kids who are getting close to applying to college, I know there's a conversation about how you tend to perform your race. That people getting advice like, well, too many Asian kids are playing the violin. You want to be the Asian kid who plays electric guitar to be the way that it stands out. It sounds like this world might make that kind of thing even more complicated.
I don't know. I think at the end of the day, it's students and their inherent interests, right? And how we think about students, their races, and what they get involved in this country is still largely influenced by how much you can afford, right? To pay for ACT, SAT prep, to pay for sports that require, heavy amounts of financial investment to even be able to play them. So I think students, more than, thinking about, which Asians are playing what instruments, I think the question becomes how, depending on your race, what are you able to get involved in and what are you able to do? And if the colleges can't see that very clearly, then that automatically disadvantages you in the process. So while the claims have been made that, this might make it easier for Asian Americans or any group to get in, I think it makes it more difficult for any student across the board to get into places like this.
Let me follow up to just that, because as we know in the decision, Robert said you can bring all of yourself in the essay, in your application process. How do you two feel about that? Does that allow you the space that you were talking about earlier as you try to talk to those nameless, faceless admissions folks about who you are?
Kelsey, do you want to go?
Yeah, I can. I guess that definitely does give me a little hope and a little bit of leeway, but then also I'm worried about the grounds in which that'll occur, because then once the Supreme Court made the decision just literally yesterday on this, it also got me thinking okay, colleges are going to try and offset the impact of this decision. I know Harvard released a statement, obviously respecting what students read about in their essays. And so then it just makes me wonder, does this make room now for more similar cases like this to happen? And additionally, it just makes things so much more unclear. And at the end of the day, I'm very concerned about like the colleges that may not be able to have the resources that like Harvard has to kind of offset these impacts. But at the end of the day, I am glad that like at least students are able to express themselves in their essays, because I think that's a core part of the application. But again, it just leaves me with a lot of uncertainty for like what this decision means for the future. The future looks very unclear to me right now, and I'm also very terrified of that.
Yeah, I would agree. And if I can just add, I think it's a question that is really important to bring up and people are not talking about enough, which is that although students can express themselves through the application, I think what this court ruling does is place that burden unfairly on students of color who are already undergoing severe discrimination with a systemic, cycle of discrimination that we experience on a day-to-day basis. That additional burden, given how taxing the application process is now placed on students, whereas the whole point is that, your institution, your system should be self-correcting. And the burden of asking about race should be on the institutions. But what this court case and this ruling does is shift that burden from the institution back onto the student. And so now the student has the burden of explaining themselves and the world that they live in, which I think is a lot to place on this.
I know in talking with other Asian American friends, especially younger people, that one of the things that's troubled them also about this case is that it tends to reinforce that Asian stereotype of the model minority, right? That these are the hardworking students who are wrongfully being left out of their spaces that they've earned in school. And I'm just curious, because you're actually both living and going to college right now, how much that is still around and how much you feel that.
Yeah, the model minority myth is incredibly harmful to the Asian American group in the US. It homogenizes us into a monolith. And Asian Americans are incredibly diverse, one of the most diverse subgroups that you can look at. And you have low-income Asian Americans, you have Asian Americans that are first generation, second generation, third generation. There's different categories of Asian Americans, South Asians, right? And different from East Asians, from Southeast Asians. And so given the heterogeneity of the Asian American population, the model minority myth just doesn't make sense, right? You can't assume that everyone has grown up in a very prestigious and, financially supportive background, or that everyone has these parents that are pushing you to do things. Many students have very, very different backgrounds from the one that the model minority myth prescribes. And so, I think that homogenizing idea is one that was also used in this case to drive wrong things forward.
Yeah, definitely. I kind of also agree with that in terms of the model minority myth. I identify as Central Asian. I'm also low income. And I think that by the opposition, because I know that just as diverse as our community is culturally and ethnically, it's also very diverse on how we stand in this issue. And I think a lot of that goes back into a portion of our community playing into this model minority myth and kind of pigeonholing them inside these stereotypes that have been placed upon them by obviously the white majority, rather than trying to uplift themselves and assert their own racial identity and kind of take control of that. And it's also, I've just noticed that a lot of Asian Americans have gone after and chased after whiteness under this model minority myth, rather than supporting each other and uplifting each other. And it's caused a huge rift in our community. And that's just what I've noticed in other Asian Americans that have played into this myth. And again, just like what Shruti said, such implications obviously lead to our community being so divided on this issue. And rather, I think that the Asian American community is so vibrant because of our differences and not because of obviously these stereotypes placed onto us. Upon coming to Harvard, I've just met such a diverse group of underrepresented Asians that I have not been able to meet otherwise if I didn't go to a diverse institution. And so I think that just further shows the harm in this model minority myth and how we need to reclaim our identity and not succumb to narratives that have been placed onto us.
Really brilliantly said, Kawsar. It's been really wonderful talking with you about this. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
And Shruti, thank you as well. It's been wonderful talking with both of you.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
Shruti Kumar and Kawsar Yazin.
So I got a couple thoughts on this.
Yeah, we've been talking about this today.
We've been talking about this. Asian, I'm black. So factually, Georgetown University did a study and found that in 2021, that without affirmative action, the numbers of Asian Americans in some of these elite institutions would actually drop. So that's one important thing.
Getting back to the question of the people that this was brought up for in the first place, that it was supposed to benefit Asian applicants.
Emotionally and angrily, I am just had it again with, here's the pie. We're all supposed to be a part, have to be able to take a part of the pie as Americans. But here's most of this pie over here is reserved for folks that don't look like us. And then they decide that here's a little piece that you two we can pitch you two against each other. And that's exactly what happened in this case. And I know that the plaintiffs in the case feel very sincerely that they were discriminated against, but I also feel they were used.
Right. And well, I mean, I feel like you kind of put your finger on the part of this that is the most emotionally uncomfortable for me as well. And that's that, again, if we go back to this, obviously being an Asian American, and it was fascinating talking with these young people because it's a different world than when I was growing up. You know, I put other for my race on my college application because wasn't sure like how Asian American, there wasn't even an Indian box on there, so wasn't sure how it would affect things. But when we're talking about the initial argument about Asians being disadvantaged in college applications, which was true, but the initial thought was not that these were people of color, other people of color taking these spots away from Asians. It was white applicants, digging into that pool.
So to be clear, Asian Americans were discriminated against in some of these institutions,
right? And
as black people.
And
were.
From what we can tell, what these experts have said to us, it doesn't seem like this ruling is going to remedy that. And more insidious, to your point about turning people against each other, and this came up in our conversation talking about this model minority myth, and this is something you and I have talked about as well, and that is, you know, this case really does sort of enforce that idea. These hardworking, studious, industrious Asians who go by the rules, you know, fly right, fly straight, and you know, for Asian Americans, hearing that at first, like that's what's wrong with the model minority? That sounds really great. People think that we're awesome, but the very term model minority. It's been researched. This goes back to the very origins of it. It was used as a term to basically beat up on African Americans. Why are you not being the model minority? And in all of this, you know, it's really disturbing as a way of again that we're having the pie that you're talking about, this piece of the pie which we feel like we are entitled to, and the way in which it feels like it turns people of color against each other, and even within communities, I would say that it's been fascinating how you know the two young people that we spoke with were very much in favor of affirmative action, but as we know, there are plenty of Asians.
Well, we heard from them.
And very prominent Supreme Court justice who's African American who's also against it.
There you go. Well, here we go.
Finally tonight, we're going to hear from what you have been texting in, commenting on YouTube, and from those of you calling in. First, we have a text. This court does not deserve the name Supreme. Call them extreme. They are racists. Thanks for spending time on this.
Oh, and we have a caller, Siddiqui from Roxbury. Go ahead, please.
Good evening. Can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead.
Yes. Let me just say that, you know, I find this conversation to be very interesting because of the fact that, now, we talk about, I didn't hear anybody mention percentages. Now, my understanding, you know, I've known some students from Harvard University, what have you, and who've talked about some of the racism they've encountered over there. But let me just say this, that now my understanding, unless I can be corrected based on information I received, is that what it is that the Asian students basically are saying that it's unfair because they feel that there were black students that were admitted that were academically less qualified or them due to the situation that we're talking about right here. So in some respects, I don't necessarily agree it's pitting against. I think it's a matter of, like what I've heard, this figures, even percentage of Harvard could be as high as 20 to 25% Asian and only 6% black. So for me, we need to look at that, put it in context, because it gives the appearance that black students are being favored and probably higher in numbers in Harvard when it's in the reverse.
Right.
So
Well, I think that's what we're trying to make clear, Arun and I, is that this is the perniciousness of this argument, and part of what the case that was being brought against Harvard and UNC was all about by using Asian Americans in that way, and that Asian Americans black students were not taking the place of Asian Americans. That's, by all of the documentation that we have, that was not what's happening. And you've struck upon something else, which is that, the term affirmative action has become something that means less than. So if it's applied to black students, then of course they were less than, and then these Asian students who were better than were not being given a shot. So that's the answer to that. That's the response to that question. So I hear you, but I hope that we've straightened that out for you.
Yeah,
Thank you very much for calling in.
Yeah, thank you, Siddiqui. We have another one of the texts that you've sent in. Former admissions officer here. While today's decision sucks, I do have faith that schools that are truly committed to diversity will adapt their admissions processes to ensure they meet their goals.
That's a strong. We're getting strong texts. I think it was important. Okay, we have another call here from Sharice from Brooklyn. Go ahead, Sharice.
You struck upon something else, which is that, the term affirmative action has become something that needs less.
Did we lose Sharice?
To black students.
Okay, all right. We lost Sharice. We have a comment coming. We'll wait for the comment.
On the though, Callie, I thought that was a fascinating point you made at the end of what Siddiqui was saying about the language here, the better than.
And the less than.
Yeah.
Yes.
It's just not something that I've heard kind of expressed so clearly.
Let me point out that we have three justices on the court that were able to benefit from affirmative action. That would be Ketanji Brown Jackson. Also, I want to point out that white women are the biggest beneficiaries of affirmative action, and Amy Coney Barrett would not be sitting on the court had she not been able to get in some schools that barred her for her gender. But because of affirmative action, she was able to get in. Next, we have a text. Colleges could do a lot by zeroing out legacy admissions and elite sports. That's Robin in Somerville. Well, that's the big issue, right? That's what Ron Sullivan was talking about.
Right.
Yeah.
There's. The legacy thing really kind of just sticks in my head, probably more than anything. And I wonder how. I guess that there's something in the Constitution about legacies, but it's interesting how. Well, this goes back to using a civil rights law to undermine affirmative action in the first place.
Well, that's very popular. I don't know that legacy is going to go away anytime soon. But when you take in combination with kids from donors, big donors, and then recruited athletes, that's a huge section of the pie before anybody else is considered. And that's where the crux comes in. And that's going to be a struggle.
That's a lot of pie.
We got another text in. I think this is a huge loss for minorities and underrepresented folks in college. The Supreme Court effectively put a ball and chain on the heel of equitable education, which is so disappointing. I have to say that disappointing is light for what a lot of people are feeling. They're feeling betrayed, actually, from this. Well, we got Sharice back.
Oh, great.
Yeah.
Sharice from Brooklyn, hello.
Hi, can you hear me?
Mm-hmm. We can hear you beautifully, yeah.
Hi, so I think I'm a unique person in this. So I had a friend who was Asian American, and I'm obviously black. And what happened was that she was applying for law school and I was applying for my PhD. And she was significantly worried about getting into law school. And what happened was that she said to me that you all are lucky. And I said to her, what do you mean by that? She pointed out that you as an African American, you get all these scholarships and all these things. And I said, well, I didn't get the memo about how things are lucky for African Americans in terms of law school and things like that. Because when you look at the whole diaspora of how you get into law school in terms of minorities, there's only so many people that are going to get into law school in terms of people of color. You have Hispanics, you have African Americans, you have so many seats at the table that they're going to admit. But the fact that she said, we're lucky. No, we're not lucky. And the fact that she would look at a way that whoever she's sitting next to would deem lucky. And like I said, I had a friend. And the fact that she's applying to law school and wants to be a lawyer, and now she's a lawyer. It is interesting how she had that lens.
Sharice, I understand what you're saying, but this is the underpinning of a racist society, frankly. I mean, and this is the struggle that we're having as we try to make progress in becoming a diverse community. And that's why this decision means so much to so many people about how it will impact beyond the college campuses and more. So thank you so much for calling in.
Sharice, though, if you're still there...
But let me say, but please allow me to say one thing. I think that sometimes secretly, some students will feel a certain way towards another student and won't say it and will feel a way. That's why these lawsuits are occurring, because they think we are lucky that we got through affirmative action.
Right.
And I didn't.
Right. I understand that.
Sharice, where are you in your education right now? Did you get in?
No, because I'm not going to tell you my story, because that's a different old story. However, I was able to succeed and do other things. But I'll just say she got in, and I've been able to have a successful educational career beyond all that.
Okay.
But it was just funny when we had that discussion. She just pinned it on that you all are lucky because of A, B, C, D, E, F, G, that they lowered the LSAT scores, all these disparate things against African Americans, and that why she couldn't get in.
I'm sorry.
And then you see all these lawsuits.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm sorry to hear that. But Sharice, thank you so much for calling. It was great to talk with you. Well, we have a comment now from Nicholas from Worcester on YouTube. It says, do you think that an establishment that is not as diverse as one may hope indicate a lack of diverse applicants to be considered for placement? Is not diversity natural happenstance?
No. No. The two of us can tell you no.
I mean,
it's not natural.
I don't know natural or happenstance.
No.
It's. You
have to be intentional about wanting to make some change on this front. I mean, we have a fraught racial history in this country, and that's just the bottom line.
Well, an application process is not going to be happenstance or natural. It's going to be pretty.
Yeah, that's the. We have a YouTube comment from John Abbott. I think we've heard that name before. I'm not sure how one reconciles the exception for the military academies choosing to value diverse cadet pools with that latitude not offered to universities. What am I missing? Any academies choosing to value diverse, okay, go ahead, next, that was repeat. What am I missing? John Abbott was a former CEO of GBH. Yeah, we'd like to know that too. That's a question that Arun asked, what are we missing? We don't know.
Yeah, well, Ketanji Brown Jackson's opinion basically said that you're acting like that essentially brown people are okay for cannon fodder.
Right.
It was a pretty stunning thing to hear.
Yes, because we know the military right now in terms of the force is overwhelmingly folks of color. So that's a really valid point. Well, that's it for tonight. Thank you so much for watching, listening, and joining the conversation. Have more to say? We'll keep the conversation going on the GBH News YouTube page. I'm Callie Crossley.
I'm Arun Rath.
Good night.